Boris, it is absolutely wonderful to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderfully well, Maria. It's lovely to see you, truly. And isn't this great that we have this method of communication in this time, particularly facing this virus, but still being able to communicate closely person to person?
Fantastic. And which language shall we do this interview in today? Because how many do you speak, Boris? Remind me.
Well, I speak five uh, badly. English, I think, is preferable. È possibile di farlo in italiano, si vorrebbe, ma it's also possible to do it in French. Je parle français couramment, c'est ma langue maternelle. So either one of those three is fine, but let's
Y-
stick with English.
You're so modest. You're so modest. Your Italian and your French is excellent. Well, absolutely, yeah. So, Boris, before we go into a bit more depth, I would really love to understand from you what was it that first got you excited about music and particularly about being a conductor?
Well, to start with, I was born into a family of musicians. My father, a violinist, a composer, a conductor, my mother, a cellist, and an organizer. She came from a very successful business family in Germany when they were, fortunately, they escaped in 1939 and were able to find their way to Canada. So in any case, I was brought up in this uh, crucible, shall we call it. We lived in one room in my grandparents' flat, the fourth floor walk up in Montreal, and everything happened in that room. They practiced, they played their instruments, they composed. So it was natural that I had to become musical in order to compete. Crying wasn't enough. I had to play an instrument. So for some reason or other, my father stuck a violin under my chin. It was an eighth size instrument, which is about yay big. And I don't actually remember that. I just remember playing the violin. And they set up all my toys once a week, and I had to give a recital for my toys, for my stuffed animals. And we put bow ties on them, and of course, so and when I first had an opportunity to play for a live audience, I looked out at them and I said, "It's just a bunch of stuffed animals. It's perfectly wonderful. I'm not scared of them."
It's just wonderful, although I'm sure the audience probably doesn't appreciate being compared to a stuffed animal. But what a lovely story.
Well, it took the fear out of, because there is a fear that we all possess when we face an audience of people and when we have to perform before an audience. And this is true as much of speaking as it is of conducting or playing an instrument. But that natural fear dissipates immediately once you're on the podium because you're in your element. You're doing something that you love to do. You love to communicate, whether it's in music or in words.
Yeah, fantastic. And how did you get into conducting from violin?
Well, my father was concertmaster of, which is lead violin of the Montreal Symphony Orchestra, and my mother was a great cook. So they invited all of the famous maestros to come and dine in our very modest duplex in Montreal. But the food was great, the wine was great, and the conversation was fantastic. So I met Stokowski and Leonard Bernstein as a young man, and Sir Thomas Beecham and Sir Adrian Boult. I mean, everyone you can imagine. Igor Markovich came to dinner one day and we went out for a walk. And he said, "Well, I know you play the violin, you play very well. What's your aim? What's your objective?" And I said, "Well, frankly, I'm getting tired of practicing 5, 6 hours a day by myself in a room and being isolated." He said, "Well, you're so loquacious. You're so natural. You're a natural communicator. You ever thought of conducting?" And I said, "Well, that's very intriguing, but surely it needs a lot of education. And I mean, how would I begin to do that?" I was 12 years old at the time this took place. And so he came to dinner that evening and he announced to my parents that I was going to Mexico to study conducting with him, which, of course, my mother went, "Wait a minute, he's 12 years old. You can't do that." Anyway, long story short, I did go to Mexico. I won the Pan American Conductors Prize. I studied there for a couple of years, then came back, went to McGill University into the Conservatoire, and the rest is history.
Wow, you had some very advanced conversations at the age of 12. That's phenomenal. Fantastic. What a lovely story. I'd love to understand a bit more because I don't know very much about orchestras, and I'm sure that there are people who also don't know the details. There's various sections of the orchestra, and I know you like to compare conducting an orchestra and being in an orchestra to business. How do the sections compare to businesses? Do departments relate to sections of the orchestra?
Well, in many ways, they are likened to departments within a corporation. you have the string players, and the string players tend to be frustrated soloists. So there is the matter of working with them in such a way that they feel contributory to the message, to the company's uh, aims and objectives. Then you have the woodwind players, and they are the soloists of the orchestra, and they're very persnickety about everything. All the little details are very important, and they spend a lot of their time making reeds and doing things like that. But they're soloists, so they're prima donnas in the orchestra in many ways. And then you have the brass players, and they, I mean, they play so loudly they can drown everyone else out in the orchestra if they had a mind to. So they're the easygoing contributors, if you will, to this unity of purpose that is an orchestra. And they enjoy drinking beer together, for example. They just have a lot of fun. And then you have the percussion players. The percussion players, well, they spend a lot of time waiting, counting bars. Moments of boredom, a long period of boredom, punctuated by moments of terror, as when they're supposed to bring in a loud cymbal crash at precisely the wrong time in the music. So you have these various cultures, if you will, and you could liken them to cultures within a corporation. And you can also liken them to national civilizations. And I found within business, often where you come from or where you're doing business has a great deal to do with how you approach the business process, the sales process, if you will. If you're selling in a place like Japan, for example, a relationship building is very important. Whereas if you're doing that in America, a very direct approach is more appropriate. So I like to use, every single speech that we do is custom directed, custom written for the corporation and their particular aims and objectives. And so I like to make these analogies. It's a completely different way of looking at a corporate structure, looking at creativity, looking at teamwork, and most particularly looking at leadership.
I can see that. I can particularly see, obviously, leadership being a conductor. I love that. I hadn't thought about all the different types of personalities, and that's fascinating. So, is that the biggest challenge of conducting an orchestra, trying to manage all the personalities, or is there a bigger challenge to it?
Well, I think that's a great challenge. And I have found, despite the fact that I was brought up and taught by people who were very authoritarian and who used that authority in the way in which they conducted, uh, they were anything but positively reinforcing. But I find the reverse is true, that positive reinforcement is the most important tool. And I've learned to rehearse, for example, without saying anything critical, simply reinforcing things that happen that are positive, that really are successful in achieving the message. And I think that's a corollary, certainly, in terms of relationships in business.
Oh, that's really good advice. I need to learn that because I'm incredibly critical. I don't know if it's an Italian thing, but I'm very critical. So reinforcing the positive, that's really good. I'm going to take that with me. Um, there's an awful amount, I can't even say it. There's an enormous amount of creativity in orchestras. And actually, you said that's one of the topics that you like to talk about. How can that be shared and extrapolated to audiences?
Well, I think that whatever you're doing in business, in order to be successful, you must be creative. Whether you're structuring a business plan, or whether you're structuring an advertising program, or for that matter, whether you're looking at the future of of an invention that you're projecting, or whether it's a new pharmaceutical, uh, there is creativity in all of the stages. And the question is, how can we be creative? How can we promote that creativity? And I have a sort of it's a bit difficult to go into in the time that we have, but I have a 4-point method, if you will, of establishing and creating, being creative, learning how to be creative. I believe we all can learn to be creative, as I believe we are all naturally musical. I mean, often people say to me, well, I can't hold a tune for anything. And I say, well, that is necessarily musicality. And if you can speak and communicate by speaking, then you are not tone deaf at all. You have to use those abilities and remember how you learned to communicate, how you learned to speak, and you will learn to be musical in the same way. So my whole method is really, my whole message is that we all have the ability within us to be creative, and it all centers around our ability to achieve positivity in everything that we do.
I love that. And actually, you've been very creative in the pandemic and in lockdown, and the fact that normally you would use tone bars for your audiences, and you would be physically present. And you've developed something very special. Could you share that with us?
Yes, indeed, I'm happy to do that. Of course, when I started to work for IBM, I started my career as a speaker with IBM. I was hired to do 18 speeches, 9 on both coasts for their what was called their 100% club. And the gentleman who hired me was one of their vice presidents who'd been to a concert of mine. And I was in the habit of speaking to audiences way before it became popular. Now conductors everywhere speak to audiences. 30 years ago, no one ever spoke to anybody. It was considered, not de rigueur. You just didn't communicate with the audience, only musically. Anyway, so we were discussing various ways of my being able to do this. And I thought, I don't want to be a talking head. I want people to understand what it's like to communicate as a player in an orchestra. And not everybody feels comfortable with singing. So I thought, well, how can I do this? And I came an idea came into my head from the ORF method that we teach children, tots when they're 4 and 5 years of age, and the teacher brings out various different instruments, among them a tone bar, which is a piece of metal with a resonator and a mallet, and you hit it and it produces a boing at a particular pitch. And I thought, well, if we take 5 of those, D, E, F sharp, G, and A, we have the first 5 notes of a D major scale, and with that, we can play an excerpt of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy, which is the European national anthem, of course. And I thought, well, everybody knows that tune, but wouldn't it be great if they felt what it's like to play in an orchestra? So we divided our audience into 5, and we assigned each group a tone bar. So you'd have, let us say, if you had an audience of 500 people, you'll have 100 playing a D, E, F sharp, G, and A. And by conducting them like conducting a carillon, I guess, a bell session, you would be able, with an orchestra, to be able to give the impression of playing. In any case, this has been very successful over the last quarter century, and I've spoken to many corporations, international corporations all over the world during the last 25 years, and have been really modestly, I say, very successful in doing it. I say modestly because I get so many letters from people saying what a great contribution it made to their business plan, how they felt, the audience felt energized. So how do we do this when we're separated? So I thought, well, first of all, I have to be able to create a tone bar that people can play. So we created an app, and the app has the 5 notes, D, E, F sharp, G, and A. You choose one of those notes, and in the middle is a very big circle. And every time you hit the pad on your cell phone, it goes boing at the pitch you've chosen. And then we took the orchestral part. Now we have delivered our orchestra live, if possible, but we also delivered it as a video. And so we have a video, and then I inserted into the video large cards when the D is playing, the E is playing, the F sharp, the G, and A. And so you choose one of the notes that you want to play, and you play along with this video by hitting your cell phone or your smartphone with this large dot on your smartphone, which is difficult to miss, every time the letter comes up. So you have the sensation of playing together with an ensemble in the same way, almost the same way that you would do live.
I think it's really clever. I think it's very creative. I love that. And it's really encouraging teamwork, which is one of the other topics that you focus on. Because I mean, imagine teamwork in an orchestra is vital.
Absolutely. And it's quite amazing that a lot of it happens because as orchestral players, we learn to both listen and perform at the same time. Because you have to be able to be aware in order to play together with anybody. You have to be able to hear them. And you have, more importantly, to anticipate what they're going to do. Now, musically, we learn how to do that. But that anticipation can also take place in a conversation or a meeting without necessarily interrupting someone. So learning how to listen is part of business, very important part of business, whether it's making a sale or contributing in a meeting. And so I try to create these analogies and look at them from a totally different point of view, from a musical point of view. So that all of those aspects end up in being able to play together. And yes, of course, you have to have all those abilities as a musician, but those abilities are transferable completely into the business environment, as far as I'm concerned. And I try to do that to help people whom I talk to achieve that.
I love that. Thank you. So, what are clients are asking you for mainly? What are the things what are the outcomes they're looking for when they hire you?
Well, I think well, if I must be honest, and I like being honest, uh, I think to a large extent they want to be entertained. That's the first thing. They want the message is sort of secondary. Oh, I saw this fellow Boris Brott. He was marvelous. It was such a lot of fun. That usually is how it starts. But he managed to put so many of our aims and objectives, of our slogans, of our watchwords, and he managed to interpret them musically in such a way that they became alive to us in a different way. So we want to have him come and do both those things to enliven our audience, usually at the beginning of a session or at the end of a session. Usually I'm hired either to start a meeting off or else to close the meeting, bringing together the various elements that they've discussed within the meeting into a unity, into a whole, with a corollary of playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or starting out with the ability of what they're looking for, what they're expecting to create in terms of their relationship with their employees or their salespeople, or how they are going to increase their bottom line by using these various tools that I try to emphasize using musical corollaries.
And I know, having worked with you, that you are one of the hardest workers when it comes to tailoring. You really do absolutely tailor to the client's requirements, which must mean it takes a lot of time and energy for you. Do you have a systematic approach to do that? Do you have certain questions you ask, or is it sort of instinctive?
Well, I think part of it is instinct, but certainly a lot has to do with conversing with the people who are in charge of the meeting. What do they want to achieve? And try and finding the corollaries that work. And I also have a storehouse of various excerpts, musical excerpts on video that I can plug in or out of my PowerPoint to make sure that the message is achieved. And so it's not just speaking, but it's also listening to music being played, various excerpts, short excerpts that prove a point or that show a point. For example, there's one section that we talk about instruments working together, or people working together, and each individual instrument sounding together. So I have an excerpt of the William Tell overture that everybody knows as the Lone Ranger, or whatever way. Maybe I'm dating myself when I say that, but I have it first of all the percussion playing, and then I add the brass, and then I add the woodwinds, and finally the strings. And each section brings a certain quality, a certain enlivens the whole thing. And finally, when it's conducted, it achieves an energy. And that's what the CEO is really. He's the energizer. He or she is the energizer. And they're the ones who are really carrying forward the message and helping those in a positive sense achieve their aims and objectives.
Thank you, Boris. We've actually come to the end. Time has just flown so fast. What thought would you like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the most important thought is really what I concentrate on in my talks, and that is be positive, particularly in this time when all our assumptions are challenged by viruses and difficulties in communication and fear. That a much greater philosopher than I said the greatest thing to fear is fear itself. Uh, don't be afraid. The world is wonderful out there, and you will find a way to get through.
That's a lovely positive thought. Thank you so much, Boris.
Thank you, Maria. It's a pleasure.